Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, Brandon, Vanessa, and Eduardo. We're going to be talking about some winemaking stylistic techniques today. I'm Amanda McCrossin, and I'm just hosting this little chat here. So I'm going to kick it off to you, Vanessa.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for joining us, Amanda. My name is Vanessa Conlin, Master of Wine and the Head of Wine for Wine Access.
Hello, everybody. I'm Brandon Sparks-Gillis, based in the Central Coast of California, down in Santa Barbara County, where I'm winemaker and partner at Dragonette.
Hi, I'm Eduardo Dingler, Vice President of Wine and Sourcing at Wine Access, and a huge fan of wine. And yourselves.
Cheers to that.
Cheers to that. Well, I think we all have wine, right? Yes, virtually. Living in this very virtual world, we all drinking wine, and we wanted to get together and talk about some things that make different grapes what they are in the glass. So with that, I think, Vanessa, you have a few questions as far as oak treatment goes. So we should probably kick it off there, because I think that's one of the most asked questions about wine.
One of the things that winemakers say is that great wine is made in the vineyard. And I think that's true to an extent, but it can't happen without the winemaker. You can have the best vineyard in the world, but you could still make a mediocre wine from it if you don't have the killer winemaking talent behind it. So Brandon, as our winemaking talent here today, I wanted to talk with you about aging vessels and fermentation vessels.
So yeah, to back up to your first point, it's absolutely true that the sort of cliche saying about great wine being made in the vineyard, the truth in that is that, as you said, you can't make great wine without great grapes. But I always like to say that really it takes 100% of effort in the vineyard and 100% of effort in the cellar in order to really bring those two things together and create greatness in wine. And the vessel is something that can make a massive impact, particularly on the style of the wine. And I like to use Sauvignon Blanc as a grape that really illustrates that, because oftentimes the vessel will literally define the style. So when we think of the classic Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, for instance, or even much of Sancerre and Pouilly-Fumé, those are wines that are briefly aged in stainless steel. And what that does is it preserves so much of that beautiful primary essence of the grape. So you get grassy pyrazines, that very bright aromatic component, and a quite linear texture from the stainless steel. And if you take those exact same grapes and mature and age them in a neutral barrel, for instance, you'll actually lose a little bit of that aromatic intensity, but you'll gain some textural depth. And then if you take that a step further and actually use new barrels, you'll actually be getting some of the flavor components from the barrel itself, a little kiss of vanilla, a little hint of baking spices, for instance. And again, it also helps to build texture and length. And oftentimes, as a winemaker, you can use multiple vessels for the same lot of wine in order to build complexity into that.
Brandon, your take on lees steering and the malolactic fermentation and everything that goes into a great Chardonnay?
That is a great question. And Chardonnay is often referred to as the winemaker's grape for that same thing, because it can be so influenced stylistically in the cellar. You know, you could take grapes from the exact same vineyard, give it to a winemaker who wants to make an early released unoaked stainless steel bottling of Chardonnay, and that's going to be linear, very much show more tension a la Sauvignon Blanc than what we often think of as sort of standard California Chardonnay. And when you bring lees and malolactic into the equation, those will actually give a great breadth to the style. So I'll start with malolactic. So the malolactic fermentation, or malolactic conversion, as we kind of call it nowadays, is the conversion of a sharper malic acid like you'd get from a green apple, that kind of snappy bite. Lactic acid is the same acid that's in milk and dairy products, and so it's much more creamy and really has a much more mouth-coating softness of texture. And so, for instance, with Chardonnay, the decision to go malolactic versus non-malolactic, it often is an influence of the winemaker style and or the climate and conditions of the grape. So for instance, here in Santa Barbara, we oftentimes work with these very cool climate vineyards that have a high amount of natural acidity. And depending on where that acidity is at harvest, oftentimes malolactic will be a tool that we'll use to moderate that. So if the acid starts out extremely high, doing some partial or full malolactic will just soften that acidity.
Can you talk a little bit about residual sugar and how that may play into a wine?
Yeah, so residual sugar is an interesting topic in wine, because oftentimes I think when the word is first mentioned, people are thinking of definitively sweet wines. But residual sugar can be used at essentially all different sugar levels in order to provide balance to the wine. There's actually Napa Cabernet, for instance, which we think of as being a dry red, where a small amount of residual sugar can balance very high alcohol and very high tannin.
To Brandon's point, sometimes even when we talk about, well, there's a little bit of, RS to this wine or residual sugar, many times sort of can be imperceptible, because to his point, if it's there to sort of provide balance, it's not going to stick out as, sweetness per se, but just provide to the overall enjoyment and perception of the wine.
Absolutely, and I think German Rieslings can give a phenomenal example of what residual sugar can do in a wine, all the way from Trocken being on the dry side up to Cabernet, Spätlese, Auslese, and even the unctuously sweet wines. There, the residual sugar is providing a beautiful balance to a very intense level of acidity.
And Brandon, on that topic of let's say, let's just use German Riesling as an example. How then are those different sweetness levels achieved? And let's just stick to table wine. Let's take, sort of fortified wines or dessert wines off the table.
So it can be done multiple ways, but the most often ways would be either by arresting the fermentation. So for instance, when the wine is coming to a point where there's just that little bit of residual sugar level that you're aiming for, you could chill the wine. Chill and or add a little bit of SO2 is often a way to arrest the fermentation and leave a little bit of sugar remaining. And then the other technique that's very common is blending, whether that's taking a slightly sweeter lot and blending that with a drier lot, or whether it's using something that was intentionally sweetened in order to add sweetness to the wine.
I'd love to hear your thoughts as a winemaker on the use of whole cluster, because I know that you make Pinot Noir and Syrah, which are two varieties which are ones that winemakers will often play around with, a little bit to a whole lot of whole cluster.
That's a great question, and whole cluster is a really valuable tool in winemaking in a number of different ways. I think as a good analogy, just to set the stage, is when we think of flavor components and the way that they interact with wine, both for flavor and for texture, oftentimes people are familiar with the difference between something that's unoaked and something that has a high level of new oak. So when we think of that as a spectrum from one side to the other, you can have that exact same spectrum with the use of destemmed fruit, fully destemmed at one side being very bright, primary, and full of fruit, and then on the other side, 100% whole cluster, allowing for a very high degree of spice and savory character, both in terms of aromas and flavors. And then also, the other thing that whole cluster really does is it influences the way that we perceive tannins and can really build tannic texture in a wine. Pinot Noir is a great example of that, where you have a grape that on its own can be quite delicate and relative to red wines on the lower side of the scale of tannin. Sometimes a little bit of tannin being built in by the use of the stems can really provide depth to the wine and length. And this is something where you get very different opinions from winemaker to winemaker, and certain people who are set in a way of sort of being 100% in one camp or 100% in another. My own personal philosophy on this is to really respect the vintage, the vineyard, and the fruit, and taste the fruit and see where that influence might really be beneficial.
And I think like everything, it's the use of ingredients and finding, again, to go back to that word we were talking about earlier, balance. Right? Because I think I've definitely, tasted wines where there's some whole cluster and it just, again, adds to sort of the overall harmony and perception and intrigue of the wine. And I've definitely tasted some where you're like, wow, they went a little too far. This is actually sort of detracting from the enjoyment of this wine.
Absolutely true. And speaking from experience, so what'll happen is when we're in the vineyard on the morning of harvest, we'll actually not only be tasting the berries while we're picking, but we'll chew on the stems a little bit. And it's very informative because there are times when you chew on the stem and it gives you this just burst of beautiful savory flavor. Oftentimes it's a little bit of sort of cinnamon, a little bit of almost like a light leafy forest floor, but something that's in a really delicious savory way. We'll incorporate some of those stems, but on the flip side, there's often times where you'll have the berry at just perfect peak level of ripeness and the berries will be delicious. But if you bite into a stem, you'll get a little burst of super herbaceous, almost jalapeno kick. So those would be the sort of stems that we would either not want to use or use at a very minuscule percentage. So it really does, I think it pays to be adaptable with that. But it's a fun technique and it's something that can really bring a lot of differentiation and complexity to the wine.
Carbonic fermentation, what's your take on it and the process?
So that's a great question, and it's also a great follow-up question to whole cluster, because oftentimes when you're using whole cluster, unless you're physically crushing the berries or doing some sort of a motion to break the berries, there will be a little bit to a lot of whole cluster of carbonic happening within the whole cluster ferment. So carbonic maceration can be a technique, again, used at a small level, in something that can bring a bit of complexity, or probably the most notable example of that would be Beaujolais. When you look at Nouveau and youthful Village Beaujolais, oftentimes those are 100% carbonic maceration. And at the 100% level, what you're doing is you're essentially gently taking whole clusters, putting them into a tank, sealing that tank, And then oftentimes adding a little bit of gas, that's why carbonic, because the carbon dioxide from that fermentation will fill the tank eventually. But essentially, it is technically a different thing from fermentation in that you're having a little intracellular fermentation that's happening within the grape itself, as opposed to within the greater must, as would happen in a destemmed ferment. And the advantages to carbonic is that it really brings this incredible pop of youthful fruitiness. It's very, very bright, powerful primary characteristic to it. So again, that's why that youthful Beaujolais will have such bright aromatics, and it will also have a really soft tannic structure. So it can be a useful thing to, if you want to have a very fresh, kind of crushable young wine style, it can work really well. And again, it can be used as a spectrum. So oftentimes within our Pinot Noirs, when we're doing a certain percentage, say a 25% whole cluster ferment, there will be a bit of carbonic that's happening within that fermenter, even though most of the fermenter is fermenting with the destemmed must. And again, what that brings, even at a small percentage, is a lift in fruit and kind of a bright energy to the wine.
American oak versus French oak. What's your big take on that?
I'm going to geek out a little bit here because I have to. So when we think of American oak and French oak, they offer very differing flavor profiles. So American oak will bring this really beautiful, powerful kind of coconut, dill, a little sweeter characteristic immediately to the wine, where French oak is something that we have that classic sort of more elegant profile. Baking spices, vanilla, a little smoke and toast. The key difference is that most American oak comes from trees which were grown in warmer forests, and that makes the grains looser, where most of the French oak comes from more northern forests where the grains stay tighter. And I know this sounds very geeky, but bear with me for a moment. So what happens is when you put a wine into something that's looser grained, the impact of the oak to the wine is going to be greater. So American oak will give a tremendous pop, particularly in that first 8 to 10 months of aging in barrel. You'll get a real definitive amount of oak hitting the wine. The French oak with the tighter grain, the interaction between the wine and the wood will happen at a slower pace, and therefore be a little bit more subtle and a little bit more elegant. And there's no right or wrong to it. I mean, I love traditional Rioja, and that's typically high percentages of new American oak, and I love Bordeaux, which is typically, high percentages of new French oak. So they really provide different flavor profiles and textural elements to the wine that can really make a big impact in the finished wine.
An example right here in Napa would be silver oak, which traditionally has used American oak instead of French. So I have another topic I would like to talk about before we have to go, which is botrytis. If I was to hold up a picture right now of a botrytis affected berry, people would probably never want to drink wine again.
Oh, gross.
Right, because it's
It looks a little woolly.
it looks a little. I think the technical word is gross. But it's sort of this magical thing, it's something I like to talk about with winemaking, is that there's so many things that we know and can control, and there's some things that are just this sort of magic that happens, right? And I feel like this is one of those things where who would have ever thought that something that can look so just disgusting, frankly, can produce such beautiful wine. And so I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on botrytis, why does it matter in the glass? But I think also remembering that Sauterne, I think, or Tokai are some of the wines that we think of botrytis, but in reality, of course there can be a small amount to a large amount on table wines too, like Chenin Blanc and Riesling.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's something that for many grapes, for instance, working with something like Pinot Noir, you would absolutely want to avoid botrytis at all cost. But then, as you said, for certain grapes, Riesling being one, Semillon for Sauterne, and a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc, that's where it can really provide just this incredible magic. So what happens is the fungus is attacking the berry, and as that rot is happening, it's dehydrating the berry, so it's concentrating the sugar, increasing its potential for alcohol and or residual sugar in the wine. But it also does this absolute magic trick with botrytis in that it also concentrates acidity. And so you can have these unctuously sweet dessert wines that have just these laser-like beams of acidity that really provide lift to the aromatics, and they provide so much definition on the palate, and they help to balance that residual sugar. And so the trick with botrytis is that it's something that you have to manage very carefully in the vineyard, and you need to harvest at just the right time, which is why most producers who are seeking to get botrytis for their sweet wines will harvest very selectively. So it's all hand-picked, and oftentimes even cluster by cluster or even berry by berry. And so you'll take trips through even the same row of vines several times through a season to select just that right amount. It's anybody drinking a dessert wine made from botrytis should have a great amount of respect for the farmer and for the winemaker, because it is the most labor-intensive style of winemaking, both in the vineyard and in the winery. very, very rare. I mean, where you might get a full bottle of wine from a vine for a kind of dry table wine, you might get a glass of wine from a vine from a highly botrytis affected grapevine.
And it's all Mother Nature, right?
Absolutely, and it is something that doesn't happen every year. Even in the traditional places like Sauternes, you have different levels at different years, that's where as you said, Mother Nature really provides the magic there.
And I think that the thing they're looking for, right, is the sort of misty mornings, but then warmer, sunnier afternoons, right? Otherwise, it can all go completely
That's exactly
awry.
right. Yeah. So you want the misty, foggy mornings, which will bring a little bit of humidity, which will increase the growth of the fungus. But then in the afternoon, those warming afternoons with a little bit of breezes will essentially dry out the clusters, so that over the nighttime they can kind of rest and not go to the dark side of the mold. I mean, that's the one thing. I mean, botrytis is literally a mold, and so you want the right amount of it in the right configuration, and that's why, again, having those natural locations, and you look at Sauternes or certain parts of Germany where these things happen in the right way and in the right vintages, nature plays a very important role, and then of course keeping an eye on that and harvesting it at the right moment is super critical.
And I think to just go back to what you said briefly, Brandon, to have respect for the winemakers who actually work with those types of grapes, because we can't control Mother Nature, right? So you have to have a certain amount of cojones
You sure do. Yeah, and it's more difficult in the winery as well.
Yes, exactly. But it does produce just the most ethereal, magical wine. Brandon, thank you so much for keeping us honest here. I always learn so much from Brandon, and I hope that that you'll come back, because we will be shooting full videos when we have the actual wines in front of us in the club, and we'd love to have you join that conversation. Maybe this one will join the conversation too.
Yay!
Oh, cute.
All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us. I hope to see you in person very soon, but until then, thanks for conversing about all things wine with us. And Brandon, thank you for your unbelievable amount of knowledge that you imparted on this today. So we'll see you all soon, and we'll do the virtual cheers.
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 Cheers, guys.
And I'll see you guys when I see you.
All right.
All right.
Take care. Cheers,
Bye,
everyone.
guys.
Bye.
Thanks.